There's nothing more heartbreaking than watching innocents stumble upon the darkness we've tried so hard to hide from them. When 73-year-old Samuel Yoder held his granddaughter's tiny hand on their morning walks, he believed he was simply sharing the beauty of God's creation with the purest soul he'd ever known. But when 3-year-old Clara vanishes into a hidden crevice along the familiar ridge, Samuel's arthritic hands shake as he forces his aging body down after her. What he discovers in that forgotten cave changes everything. A rusted revolver, skeletal remains, and a tin box of yellowed letters that expose a decades-old murder his community has quietly called an accident. The evidence points to respected men still walking among his neighbors, still breaking bread at Sunday gatherings. Samuel realizes the truth could shatter the peace his generation has carefully preserved, destroying old friendships and tearing apart families who've built their lives on carefully maintained silence. But could staying quiet endanger Clara's future? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Pennsylvania hills like a gentle blessing, and Samuel Yoder moved through it with the careful, measured steps of a man who had learned to respect both his years and his limitations. His walking stick, hand-carved oak that had belonged to his father, tapped a steady rhythm against the worn path that wound through the ridge above his farm. The stick bore the smooth patina of decades of use, its surface worn to silk by 2 generations of weathered hands. "Granddaughter, look!" Clara's voice rang out like silver bells in the crisp morning air. At 3 years old, she possessed that wonderful ability to find magic in the most ordinary things. A dewdrop clinging to a spider's web, a red-winged blackbird's flash of scarlet, the way shadows danced between the oak leaves. Samuel paused, his breath forming small clouds in the cool air, and watched as his granddaughter crouched beside a patch of wild violets that had somehow survived the early October frost. Her small fingers, still dimpled with baby fat, reached out to touch the delicate purple petals with a reverence that made his heart swell. "They're sleeping flowers, aren't they, granddaughter?" she asked, using the Pennsylvania Dutch term for grandfather that came as naturally to her as breathing. "Ja, little one," Samuel replied, his voice carrying the gentle accent that 40 years in America had softened but never quite erased. "They're getting ready for their long winter's rest." This had become their ritual, these early morning walks before the rest of the world stirred. Samuel cherished these moments more than Clara could possibly understand. At his age, he had learned that time was the most precious gift you could give someone, and he gave it freely to this child who had captured his heart so completely. The path they followed had been carved by 3 generations of Yoder feet. Samuel's grandfather had first cleared this trail when he settled the land in 1892. A young man with calloused hands and dreams of building something lasting in this new country. Samuel's father had walked here daily, checking on the livestock and surveying his domain with the quiet pride of a man who had worked for everything he owned. Now Samuel continued the tradition, though his purposes had shifted from the practical to the spiritual. Below them, the valley spread out like a patchwork quilt sewn by the hand of the Almighty himself. The Yoder farm occupied the gentle slope that led down to Miller's Creek, where the old water wheel still turned lazily, powering the grist mill that had served the community for over a century. Samuel could see his son David already at work in the barn, his movements efficient and purposeful as he tended to the morning milking. David's wife, Rebecca, Clara's mother, would be in the kitchen by now, kneading dough for the day's bread and humming the old hymns that had sustained their people through generations of joy and sorrow. The sight filled Samuel with a deep contentment. This was continuity. This was legacy. This was what he had worked his entire life to preserve and protect. "Tell me about the old days, granddaughter," Clara said, slipping her small hand into his gnarled one. Her fingers were warm despite the morning chill, and Samuel marveled at how perfectly her tiny hand fit within his palm. Samuel smiled. settling onto a fallen log that provided the perfect vantage point for surveying their little corner of God's creation. Clara climbed up beside him, her legs swinging freely as she waited for one of his stories. These moments, when she chose his company over her toys, his words over the distractions of the modern world, these were the treasures he would carry with him to his grave. "Well," he began, his voice taking on the cadence of a natural storyteller, "when I was just about your age, my own gross-daddy used to bring me up here every morning. Just like we do now." Clara's eyes widened with delight. She loved hearing about the connections that bound their family together across the years, though Samuel suspected she didn't yet fully grasp the profound continuity she represented. He was a stern man. "My gross-daddy," Samuel continued, "but kind in his way. He taught me that the land doesn't belong to us, we belong to it. We're just borrowers, you see, taking care of something precious until it's time to pass it on to the next generation." Samuel pointed toward the cluster of white farmhouses that dotted the valley below. "Each of those families has been here for generations, Clara. The Millers, the Bylers, the Stoltzfus clan, we're all connected like threads in a tapestry. When I was young, I thought those connections were just about shared history and helping with the harvest. Now I understand they run much deeper." He paused, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead, riding the morning thermals with effortless grace. "Community isn't just about living near each other, little one. It's about choosing to bear each other's burdens, to celebrate each other's joys, and sometimes to carry each other's secrets." Clara nodded solemnly, though Samuel suspected she was responding more to his tone than his words. Still, these conversations mattered. Children absorbed wisdom in mysterious ways, and the lessons that seemed to pass right through them often surfaced years later when they needed them most. The sound of a buggy approaching on the main road below drew Samuel's attention. Even from this distance, he could identify the occupant by the particular way the horse held its head and the distinctive rocking motion of the carriage. Jacob Miller was making his morning rounds, checking on the widows and elderly members of their church district. At 78, Jacob was one of the few men in the community older than Samuel, and his dedication to caring for others had earned him universal respect and admiration. Samuel raised his hand in greeting, and Jacob returned the gesture with a wave that seemed to encompass both acknowledgement and blessing. This, too, was part of the rhythm of their lives, these small gestures that reinforced the bonds of community and mutual care. "Who's that, gross-daddy?" Clara asked, following his gaze. "That's Jacob Miller," Samuel replied. "He's been taking care of people in our community longer than your daddy has been alive. When someone needs help fixing a roof or splitting firewood, Jacob is usually the first one there with his tools and his willing hands." Samuel remembered when Jacob had arrived at their door 3 days after Samuel's wife, Martha, had passed away 2 years ago. The older man hadn't said much. Their people weren't given to flowery speeches, but he had spent the entire day helping Samuel organize Martha's belongings and prepare for the funeral. His presence had been a balm during those dark hours when grief threatened to overwhelm even Samuel's deep faith. "He's been like a brother to me for more years than I care to count," Samuel added, watching as Jacob's buggy disappeared around the bend. "In a community like ours, relationships like that are what hold everything together." Clara seemed to accept this explanation, her attention already shifting to a squirrel that was scolding them from a nearby branch. Samuel watched her with amusement, remembering how his own attention had flitted from one wonder to another when he was her age. The capacity for joy and wonder, that was perhaps the greatest gift of childhood, and one of the many things he hoped to help her preserve for as long as possible. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Samuel reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought him to this moment. He had been born in this valley, had left it briefly as a young man when wanderlust and the promise of adventure called to him, and had ultimately returned with the wisdom that home was not a place you escaped from, but a place you chose. He had married Martha in the little white church that stood at the crossroads, had raised 4 children in the farmhouse his father had built, and had watched those children grow into responsible adults who would carry on the traditions and values that defined their people. Now, in what he suspected might be the final chapter of his life, he found his greatest joy in these simple morning walks with a child who represented everything he hoped his family's future would become. Clara was bright and curious and kind, with a natural compassion that reminded him so much of Martha, it sometimes took his breath away. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the mist and revealing the full glory of autumn in the Pennsylvania countryside. The maples were showing their red and gold finery. The oaks had donned their russet coats, and even the practical ash trees had managed to produce a respectable display of yellow. It was the kind of morning that made Samuel grateful for every year God had granted him. Every sunrise he had been privileged to witness. "We should head back," Samuel said finally, rising from the log with the careful movements of a man whose joints protested the morning chill. "Your mother will have breakfast ready soon, and you know how she worries when we're gone too long." Clara slipped down from the log and took his hand again, ready for the gentle descent back to the farmhouse and the beginning of another day in their ordered, peaceful world. As they walked, Samuel found himself offering up a silent prayer of gratitude for this child, for this place, for this life that had been such an unexpected blessing. He had no way of knowing that this would be the last morning when such simple gratitude would be enough. The last time he would walk this path in innocence, believing that the greatest challenges facing his family were the ordinary struggles of aging and weather and keeping a farm. Running in an increasingly complicated world, tomorrow would bring questions he wasn't prepared to answer and responsibilities he had never sought. But this morning, he was simply a grandfather walking with his beloved granddaughter, and that was more than enough. The next morning dawned grey and blustery, with clouds scudding across the sky like sheep fleeing from an unseen predator. Samuel felt the change in his bones, the way his knuckles ached more than usual, the stiffness in his left knee that always preceded a storm. At his age, he had become an unwilling barometer, his body announcing weather changes days before they arrived. Clara seemed undaunted by the threatening sky as she skipped beside him up the familiar path, her small boots crunching through the carpet of fallen leaves. She had insisted on bringing her favorite doll, a simple cloth creation that Rebecca had sewn from scraps of blue calico. The doll, named Baby Sarah after Clara's great-grandmother, traveled everywhere with Clara these days, a constant companion in her expanding world of imagination. "Grossdaddy, why do the leaves change colors?" Clara asked, pausing to examine a particularly brilliant maple leaf that had caught her attention. Samuel leaned heavily on his walking stick, grateful for the excuse to catch his breath. The climb seemed more challenging today, though he wasn't sure if that was due to the weather or his advancing years. "Well, little one, the leaves have been green all summer because they've been working so hard to catch the sunshine and help the tree grow. But now that winter's coming, they're getting ready to rest. The green goes away, and we can see all the other beautiful colors that were hiding underneath all along." Clara nodded thoughtfully, clearly processing this explanation in the serious way she approached all new information. "Like when Mama takes off her apron and we can see her pretty blue dress underneath." "Exactly like that," Samuel said, smiling at her simple wisdom. Children had a gift for finding the perfect analogy, often understanding complex truths better than adults who overcomplicated everything. They continued their climb. But Samuel noticed that Clara kept looking off to the right, toward a section of the ridge he rarely explored. The terrain there was rougher, with rocky outcroppings and dense undergrowth that made walking treacherous, even for someone with steady legs. He had always steered their walks toward the easier paths, partly for safety and partly because the views were better from the established trail. "What's over there, Grossdaddy?" Clara asked, pointing toward the thick stand of pine trees that had grown up around the rocky area. "Just more woods, little one. Nothing special. The walking is harder there, and the views aren't as pretty." But Clara had stopped walking altogether now, her small face scrunched up in concentration as she stared into the pine grove. "I hear something," she said. Samuel paused to listen, but all he could make out was the usual symphony of morning sounds, birds calling to each other, the whisper of wind through the branches, the distant lowing of cattle in the valley below. His hearing wasn't what it used to be, though, and he had learned to trust Clara's younger, sharper senses. "What kind of something?" he asked. "Like singing," Clara said, "but not people singing, like the wind is singing a secret song." Samuel felt a slight chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Clara had always been sensitive to things others couldn't perceive, sounds, moods, the subtle tensions that adults thought they were hiding from children. Martha used to say that some children were born with thinner veils between worlds, and Clara often displayed an awareness that went beyond her years. "Secrets need to come out," Clara announced with the matter-of-fact certainty of a 3-year-old. Before Samuel could respond, she had darted off the path and was heading straight toward the pine grove. "Clara!" "Wait," Samuel called. But she was already disappearing into the undergrowth with the fearless determination that made her both delightful and terrifying to watch. Samuel hurried after her as quickly as his aging legs would allow, his walking stick catching on exposed roots and loose stones. The pine needles were slippery underfoot, and more than once he had to grab onto a low branch to keep his balance. His heart was pounding, partly from exertion, mostly from fear. The terrain here was dangerous, full of hidden holes and rocky crevices that could easily trap or injure a small child. "Clara!" he called again, his voice echoing strangely in the dense grove. "Come back here right now!" But there was no answer, and Samuel's fear ratcheted up another notch. He pushed through the undergrowth, branches catching at his coat and scratching his hands. The smell of pine was overwhelming here, mixed with the earthier sense of moss and decay. It was a wild place, untouched by human care, the kind of place where accidents happened. Then he heard it, Clara's voice, but muffled and distant as if she were calling from inside a box. "Gross Daddy! Come see, there's a sleeping man down here." Samuel's blood turned to ice water. He crashed through the remaining undergrowth, abandoning all caution, and emerged into a small clearing dominated by a massive granite outcropping. And there, at the base of the rock face, was a gap he had never noticed before, a crevice barely wide enough for a child to squeeze through, hidden behind a screen of wild honeysuckle vines. Clara's voice was coming from inside the opening. Samuel dropped to his knees beside the crevice, his arthritic joints screaming in protest. The opening was perhaps 18 inches wide at its broadest point, narrowing to almost nothing before disappearing into the rock. How had he never seen this before? He had walked this ridge for 70 years, and yet this cave, because that's what it had to be, had remained completely hidden from view. "Clara, you need to come out right now," Samuel called into the darkness. "But Gross Daddy, there's a sleeping man, and he has a gun. Just like the English cowboys on David's books." Samuel's mouth went dry. A gun. What was Clara talking about? "Clara, listen to me very carefully. Don't touch anything. Just come back toward my voice right now." "I can't, Gross Daddy. The space is too narrow here." "I think I went down too far." Samuel closed his eyes and said a quick prayer for strength. Then, moving more carefully than he had moved in years, he began to work his way into the crevice. The opening was barely wide enough for his shoulders, and he had to turn sideways and exhale completely to squeeze through. His walking stick clattered to the ground outside. Forgotten in his desperate need to reach Clara, the passage opened up after the first few feet, revealing a natural cave that stretched back into the hillside, farther than Samuel could see in the dim light filtering through the entrance. The air inside was cool and still, carrying a musty smell that spoke of long years without fresh air or sunshine. And there, no more than 10 feet from the entrance, Clara was crouched beside what had once been a human being. Samuel's vision swam as he took in the scene. Skeletal remains, still partially clothed in the rotted remnants of what might have been a flannel shirt and work pants. And clutched in the bony fingers of one hand, just as Clara had said, was a revolver, old and heavily rusted, but unmistakably a weapon of violence. "He's been sleeping for a really long time," Clara said conversationally, apparently unconcerned by the macabre scene. "Look, Grossdaddy, he has a box." Samuel's eyes followed Clara's pointing finger to a small tin container that sat near the skeleton's feet. The metal was corroded but intact, and Samuel could see that it was sealed shut. Whatever was inside had been protected from the moisture and decay that had claimed everything else in this forgotten tomb. "Clara," Samuel said, his voice barely steady, "I need you to come away from there right now. Don't touch anything else. Just come to Grossdaddy." Clara obediently stood and walked over to him, apparently untroubled by what she had discovered. Samuel gathered her into his arms, holding her close and feeling his heart hammering against his ribs. This was no accident, no natural death. Someone had died violently in this cave, and their body had been hidden away from the world for God only knew how long. As Samuel held his granddaughter and stared at the evidence of murder that lay before them, one thought echoed through his mind with terrible clarity. Nothing would ever be the same again. The rusted revolver gleamed dully in the filtered light. A messenger from the past, bearing secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. And now, through the innocent curiosity of a 3-year-old child, those secrets were about to be dragged into the light, whether the world was ready for them or not. Samuel's hands trembled as he carefully extracted the tin box from the cave, his movements deliberate despite the urgency he felt to get Clara away from this place of death. The metal container was heavier than expected, and he could hear something shifting inside. Papers, by the sound of it. Whatever secrets this box contained had been important enough for someone to seal them away with the dead. "We're going home now," Samuel told Clara firmly, lifting her up and carrying her toward the cave entrance. His back protested the additional weight, but he wasn't about to let her walk near those remains again. Getting out of the cave proved more challenging than getting in. Samuel had to pass Clara through the narrow opening first, instructing her to wait for him on the other side. Then he struggled through himself, the tin box clutched against his chest, his coat tearing on the rough stone edges. By the time he emerged, scratched and breathing heavily, Clara was already picking wildflowers as if nothing unusual had happened. "Don't tell anyone about our adventure today," Samuel said, trying to keep his voice casual. "This will be our special secret, just between us." Clara nodded solemnly. At 3, she was still young enough to accept adult instructions without question, especially from her beloved grandfather. Samuel prayed that innocence would last long enough for him to figure out what he had stumbled into. The walk back to the farmhouse felt endless. Samuel's mind raced as he tried to process what he had seen. The skeleton had been wearing work clothes, the kind any farmer in their community might wear. But the presence of the gun suggested violence, and the hidden location spoke of deliberate concealment. Someone had been murdered and hidden away, probably decades ago given the state of the remains. But who? And why? And most troubling of all, who in their peaceful community had been capable of such an act? Once Clara was safely inside the house and distracted with her breakfast, Samuel retreated to his small workshop behind the barn. It was the one place where he could be certain of privacy. Rebecca never ventured into what she considered his domain of sawdust and half-finished projects, and David was busy with the morning chores. Samuel's hands shook as he worked the corroded latch on the tin box. The metal was stubborn, weakened by years of moisture and rust, but eventually it gave way with a soft click that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet workshop. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, were perhaps 24 letters. The paper was yellowed and brittle, but the ink had survived better than Samuel had dared hope. He lifted the first letter carefully, unfolding it with the reverence of someone handling an ancient manuscript. The handwriting was feminine, the script elegant despite obvious emotion. "My dearest Thomas, I cannot continue living this lie. Heinrich suspects something, and I fear what he might do if he discovers the truth about us. We must meet one more time to end this properly or to find a way forward. I cannot bear the weight of this deception any longer. All my love, Anna, Samuel's breath caught. Anna and Thomas, names he recognized, though it took him a moment to place them. Then the memory surfaced, Anna Beiler and Thomas Stoltzfus. Anna had been Heinrich Beiler's wife, and Thomas had been a young man in the community who had supposedly died in a farming accident nearly 30 years ago. Samuel remembered the tragedy vaguely. Thomas had been found dead in Miller's Creek, apparently drowned when his foot became trapped under a fallen log during flood season. But if these were Thomas's remains in the cave, then the official story had been a lie. Samuel read through several more letters, his horror growing with each revelation. The correspondence painted a picture of a passionate affair between Anna and Thomas, carried on in secret for months, while Anna's husband Heinrich remained oblivious. But the later letters revealed growing desperation. Anna had discovered she was pregnant, and Thomas was pressing her to leave Heinrich and run away with him. The final letter was different, written in a masculine hand that Samuel didn't recognize. Thomas, if you think you can destroy my family and steal my wife, you are gravely mistaken. Meet me at the old limestone quarry at midnight, if you want to settle this like men. Come alone, or Anna will pay the price for your cowardice. HB Heinrich Beiler. Samuel's stomach churned as the implications became clear. Heinrich had discovered the affair, had lured Thomas to a confrontation, and had apparently killed him. But instead of reporting the death as a crime of passion, someone had gone to elaborate lengths to make it appear Thomas had died accidentally in the creek. Samuel leaned back in his wooden chair, his mind reeling. Heinrich Beiler had been a respected member of their community, a man who had served as a deacon in their church for 20 years before his death from a heart attack 5 years ago. He had been known for his stern devotion to their faith and his unwavering moral standards. The idea that he had been capable of murder and that the community had somehow been complicit in covering it up challenged everything. Samuel thought he knew about the people he had lived among his entire life, but the letters told only part of the story. If Heinrich had killed Thomas, who had helped him conceal the crime? Moving a body to that hidden cave would have required assistance, and creating the false story about Thomas drowning would have demanded the cooperation of others. Someone with authority would have had to falsify records, declare the death accidental without a proper investigation. Samuel's arthritis flared as he carefully refolded the letters and placed them back in the tin box. His joints ached from the morning's exertion, but the deeper pain came from the knowledge that his peaceful world had been built on a foundation of lies and violence. For 30 years, he had unknowingly shared communion with murderers, had trusted his family's safety to people who were capable of the worst kinds of deception. The sound of Clara's laughter drifted in from the house, a pure and joyful sound that seemed to come from another world entirely. Samuel closed his eyes and tried to center himself, to find the spiritual equilibrium that had always sustained him through difficult times. But the weight of what he had discovered pressed down on him like a physical burden. What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? Thomas Stoltzfus had been someone's son, someone's brother. He had deserved justice, deserved to be properly buried with the dignity due to any child of God. Instead, he had been left to rot in a hidden cave while his killer lived out his life in respect and honor. But Heinrich was dead now, beyond earthly justice. Anna, if she was still alive, would be an elderly woman, probably carrying the guilt of this secret for 3 decades. Exposing the truth now would destroy families, shatter the peace of their community, and serve no purpose except satisfying Samuel's need for justice. Or would it? Samuel opened his eyes and looked at the tin box sitting on his workbench. Inside those letters was the truth about Thomas Stoltzfus's death, and truth had its own moral weight. Regardless of the consequences, didn't the dead deserve to have their stories told? Didn't the living deserve to know what kind of people they had been honoring all these years? As Samuel sat in his workshop, surrounded by the familiar smells of wood shavings and linseed oil, he felt the comfortable certainties of his life crumbling around him. The letters in the tin box were more than just evidence of a long-ago crime. They were a test of his own character, a challenge to choose between the easy path of silence and the harder road of truth. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a disturbing question had begun to take shape. If Heinrich Beiler had been capable of murder 30 years ago, what other secrets might be buried in their seemingly peaceful community? That evening, Samuel found himself unable to concentrate on the simple rituals that usually brought him peace. During their family devotions, as David read from the book of Psalms and Rebecca's gentle voice joined Clara's in singing, "Jesus loves me," Samuel's mind kept drifting to the tin box hidden in his workshop. The familiar words about truth and justice seemed to mock him from across the decades, spoken by lips that might have been complicit in covering up murder. After the family had retired for the night, Samuel made his way back to the workshop. He lit the oil lamp with hands that still trembled slightly and carefully removed the letters from their hiding place. This time, he read them more systematically, looking for details he might have missed in his initial shock. The correspondence spanned nearly 8 months, beginning with tentative expressions of mutual attraction and escalating into passionate declarations of love. Anna's handwriting revealed an educated woman trapped in what appeared to be a loveless marriage. Her early letters spoke of loneliness and Heinrich's increasing coldness toward her. His obsession with his standing in the community at the expense of their personal relationship. Thomas, based on Anna's responses to his apparently destroyed letters, had been younger than her, perhaps in his early 20s to her 30-something. He had been pressing her to leave Heinrich, promising they could start fresh in another state where no one would know their history. But Anna's letters revealed her growing desperation as she realized the impossibility of their situation. "I am with child," she had written in what appeared to be one of her final letters. "Heinrich has not touched me in months, so he will know immediately that the baby is not his. Thomas, my beloved, we are running out of time. If we are to have any chance at happiness, we must act soon." Samuel set the letter down and rubbed his tired eyes. Anna had been pregnant with Thomas's child when Heinrich discovered the affair. That would have been an unforgivable disgrace in their community, a betrayal that would have destroyed not just Heinrich's marriage, but his reputation and standing in the church. The next morning, Samuel found an excuse to visit his neighbor, Elizabeth Stoltzfus, Thomas's elderly aunt, who lived alone in the small house behind the original Stoltzfus homestead. Elizabeth was 92 and sometimes confused, but her memory of distant events remained remarkably sharp. "Elizabeth," Samuel said, settling into the chair beside her kitchen table, "I've been thinking about family history lately, and I was wondering if you could tell me about your nephew Thomas, the one who died so young." Elizabeth's watery blue eyes focused on him with surprising intensity. "Thomas," she repeated, her voice carrying 3 decades of grief. "Such a good boy, so full of life and dreams. It broke my heart when he drowned in that creek. Do you remember much about that time? About how he died?" Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, her gnarled hands working at the edge of her apron. "I never understood it," she said finally. "Thomas was the strongest swimmer in our family. Even as a child, he could stay underwater longer than any of his cousins. For him to drown in Miller's Creek, even during flood season, it never made sense to me." Samuel leaned forward slightly. "Did he seem troubled before he died? Worried about anything?" "Oh, he was different those last few months," Elizabeth said, nodding slowly. "Distracted. He would come to visit me, but his mind was always somewhere else. I asked him once if there was a girl he was courting, and he got the strangest look on his face. Said there was someone special, but it was complicated." Samuel's heart raced. "Complicated how?" He wouldn't say. But I could tell it was eating at him. The boy had always worn his heart on his sleeve, and in those last weeks he looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. Elizabeth's eyes grew distant. I keep thinking, if only I had pressed him to tell me what was wrong. Maybe I could have helped somehow. After leaving Elizabeth's house, Samuel made another stop, this one at the small cemetery behind their church. He had attended Thomas Stoltzfus's funeral 30 years ago, though he remembered little about it, except the general sense of tragedy that surrounded the death of someone so young. Thomas's grave was in the newer section of the cemetery, marked by a simple limestone headstone that bore only his name, dates, and a verse from Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. It was a common choice for unexpected deaths, suggesting divine timing that mortal minds couldn't comprehend. Standing there in the afternoon sunshine, Samuel felt the full weight of the injustice that had been done. Thomas had been murdered and hidden away like a shameful secret, while his family had been allowed to believe he had died accidentally. They had grieved for a drowning victim, while his real body lay mouldering in a hidden cave, denied even the dignity of proper burial. As Samuel walked home, his mind turned to the photograph he had remembered seeing in his wife's collection of community pictures. Martha had been meticulous about documenting church gatherings and community events, believing that such records were important for preserving their history. If his memory was correct, she had a picture from the harvest celebration of 1994, the year before Thomas's supposed death. Back at the house, Samuel went to the cedar chest where Martha's photographs were stored. It took him nearly an hour to find what he was looking for, but there it was, a large group photograph taken on the church steps after their harvest Thanksgiving service. Samuel studied the faces carefully, using a magnifying glass to examine the details. There, in the back row, stood a young man who matched Elizabeth's description of Thomas, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of open, honest face that suggested someone incapable of deceit. He was standing near Anna Byler, though they weren't next to each other. But Samuel could see something in their positioning, a subtle awareness of each other's presence that spoke of hidden connection. And there, in the front row with the other deacons, was Heinrich Byler, a stern-faced man with cold eyes and a mouth set in permanent disapproval. Even in a photograph meant to celebrate God's bounty, Heinrich looked like a man perpetually displeased with the world around him. But what caught Samuel's attention most was another face in the photograph, Jakob Miller, standing with the other community elders. Jakob had been younger then, perhaps in his late 40s, but already carrying the air of quiet authority that would make him such a respected figure in their community. Samuel stared at Jakob's face in the photograph, trying to reconcile the kind, generous man he knew with the possibility that he might have been involved in covering up Thomas's murder. Jakob had been the one who organized community responses to crises, the one people turned to when difficult decisions needed to be made quickly and quietly. If Heinrich had killed Thomas in a moment of rage, Jakob would have been exactly the kind of person he might have turned to for help disposing of the body and creating a cover story. And Jacob's position in the community would have given him the authority to ensure that no awkward questions were asked about Thomas's supposed drowning. As Samuel sat at his kitchen table, studying the faces of people he had known and trusted for decades, he felt a profound sense of isolation settling over him. The letters hidden in his workshop contained the power to destroy families and shatter the peace of their community. But they also represented the only chance for Thomas Stoltzfus to receive the justice he had been denied for 30 years. The question that haunted Samuel as evening fell was not whether he had a moral obligation to reveal the truth. He knew he did. The question was whether he had the courage to act on that obligation, knowing that doing so might destroy everything he held dear about the community that had shaped his entire life. The following Sunday brought the monthly church meal, and Samuel found himself studying his neighbors with new eyes. As he sat at one of the long tables set up in the church fellowship hall, watching families he had known for decades share food and laughter, He felt like a stranger among them. Every familiar face now carried the potential for deception. Every friendly greeting might be hiding secrets darker than he had ever imagined. Jacob Miller sat 3 tables away, his weathered hands steady as he helped serve pie to the younger children. At 78, Jacob moved with the careful deliberation of age, but his mind remained sharp and his dedication to the community unwavering. Samuel watched as Jacob patiently cut a slice of apple pie for little Mary Byler, Anna's granddaughter, and felt his stomach clench with the irony of it. After the meal, as the men gathered outside to discuss the upcoming harvest work and the women organized the cleanup, Samuel found himself in conversation with David Stoltzfus, Thomas's younger brother. David was now in his 40s, a successful carpenter who had built many of the newer homes in their community. He had been only 15 when Thomas died, and Samuel had always seen shadows of grief in his eyes when Thomas's name was mentioned. "I've been thinking about Thomas lately," Samuel said carefully, watching David's reaction. Elizabeth mentioned he seemed troubled in those last months before his accident. David's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Thomas was always one to keep his troubles to himself. Even as boys, he would carry burdens without asking for help. He paused, his eyes growing distant. "I sometimes wonder if things might have been different if he had felt he could confide in someone. What kind of troubles do you think he was carrying?" David was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where storm clouds were beginning to gather. "There were rumors," he said finally. "Nothing specific, you understand, but people talked. Some said Thomas had been seen places he shouldn't have been, spending time with people who weren't appropriate for a young, unmarried man." Samuel felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of rumors?" "The kind that destroy reputations and tear families apart," David replied, his voice heavy with old pain. "I never gave them much credence. Thomas was a good man with a good heart. But in a community like ours, even the suggestion of impropriety can be devastating." As Samuel walked home that evening, David's words echoed in his mind. If there had been rumors about Thomas's behavior before his death, then others in the community might have suspected the affair with Anna. That would mean the cover-up hadn't been limited to just Heinrich and perhaps Jakob. It could have involved anyone who wanted to protect the community from scandal. The next morning, Samuel made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation he possessed. He walked to Jacob Miller's farm, carrying his father's walking stick and wearing the expression of a man preparing for the most difficult conversation of his life. Jacob was in his workshop, a spacious building behind his house where he had spent decades crafting furniture and household items for their community. The workshop was a testament to a lifetime of skilled craftsmanship. Hand tools arranged with military precision, workbenches worn smooth by years of use, and the lingering scent of wood shavings and linseed oil that spoke of honest labor. Samuel had always admired Jacob's woodworking skills. The older man's hands, despite their age and the tremor that had developed in recent years, could still coax beauty from rough lumber. He had built the pulpit in their church, the communion table, and most of the benches where their community gathered for worship. "Samuel," Jacob said, looking up from the chair he was repairing. "Good to see you. How's little Clara?" "She's well," Samuel replied, though his throat felt tight with tension. "Jacob, I need to ask you about something. About the old days." Something flickered in Jacob's eyes, so briefly that Samuel might have imagined it, but it was there. A moment of wariness, of calculation, that seemed out of place in the face of a man Samuel had always trusted completely. "The old days cover a lot of territory," Jacob said carefully. Setting down his sandpaper and giving Samuel his full attention, Samuel took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about Thomas Stoltzfus lately. About his death." Jacob's expression didn't change, but Samuel noticed his hands had stilled completely on the workbench. That was a tragedy. Such a young man with so much life ahead of him. "Do you remember much about that time? About how he died?" "He drowned in Miller's Creek during flood season. His foot got trapped under a fallen log, and by the time they found him, it was too late. Jakob's voice was steady, but Samuel detected something rehearsed about the words, as if they had been repeated many times over the years. Samuel chose his next words very carefully. "I was wondering about the details. Who found him? How long was he missing before the body was discovered?" Jakob turned back to his work, his movements now slightly more aggressive than necessary. "It's been 30 years, Samuel. Why all these questions about ancient history? I suppose I've been thinking about legacy lately, about the stories we tell our children and grandchildren. I want to make sure I have the facts right." "Some facts are better left buried," Jacob said, and Samuel felt the words like a physical blow. The older man looked up, and for a moment, their eyes met with an intensity that spoke of dangerous territory being approached. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean," Samuel said, though his racing heart suggested he understood perfectly. Jacob set down his tools and moved closer to Samuel. Close enough that Samuel could smell the old spice cologne he had worn for as long as anyone could remember. "Samuel, you're a good man with a good family. Clara is a precious child, and your son David is building a fine life for himself and Rebecca. Sometimes, when we start digging into the past, we uncover things that can hurt the people we love most." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that Jacob had perhaps always known, that Samuel was asking the wrong questions. Or rather, the right questions that no one was supposed to ask. "I should get going," Samuel said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Rebecca will be wondering where I am." "Give my regards to your family," Jacob said, his tone friendly again, but his eyes still carrying that watchful intensity. "And Samuel, be careful on those morning walks with Clara. That ridge can be dangerous for an old man and a small child. Lots of hidden hazards up there that people don't notice until it's too late." Samuel nodded and turned to leave, but Jacob's voice stopped him at the door. "Oh, and Samuel, if you ever find yourself with questions about the past, you might want to talk to Bishop Eli. He was there during Thomas's time, and he has a good memory for the important details." As Samuel walked home, his walking stick tapping against the hard-packed earth, he realized that his investigation had just become infinitely more dangerous. Jacob's workshop had been filled with tools, hand planes, chisels, saws, mallets, all the implements a skilled craftsman would need to work with wood. But they were also exactly the kind of tools someone would need to build a coffin, or to conceal evidence in places where no one would think to look. The careful way Jacob had arranged his tools, the precision with which everything was organized, it spoke of a mind that planned carefully and left nothing to chance. And if Jacob had been involved in covering up Thomas's murder, then Samuel had just announced his suspicions to a man who had already proven himself capable of keeping deadly secrets for 30 years. That night, Samuel lay awake, listening to the wind outside his bedroom window, and wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Samuel spent the next several days in a state of heightened awareness, watching for any sign that Jacob's subtle warning had been more than just words. Every creak of the old farmhouse at night made him tense. Every unexpected visitor during the day sent his pulse racing. But life in their community continued with its usual peaceful rhythm. And gradually, Samuel began to wonder if he had overreacted to what might have been nothing more than an old man's general caution about stirring up painful memories. It was Clara who inadvertently provided the breakthrough Samuel needed. During their morning walk, which he now kept strictly to the established path, nowhere near the hidden cave, she pointed toward the Beeler farm in the distance and asked an innocent question that nearly stopped Samuel's heart. "Grostadi, why does the sad lady visit the sleeping man's grave when she thinks nobody's watching?" Samuel followed Clara's pointing finger to the small family cemetery behind the Beeler farmhouse. From their position on the ridge, they had a clear view of the fenced burial plot where 3 generations of Beelers lay at rest. And there, kneeling beside one of the headstones, was an elderly woman in a dark dress. "What do you mean, Clara?" Samuel asked, though his mouth had gone dry. "I see her sometimes when we walk. She goes there early in the morning, before the sun comes up all the way. She cries and talks to the ground." "Why does she do that?" Samuel's mind raced. The woman had to be Anna Byler, now in her 60s, and still living on the old farm, though Heinrich had been dead for 5 years. If Clara had seen her visiting Thomas's supposed grave in the Stoltzfus cemetery, but no, Clara was pointing toward the Byler plot, not the Stoltzfus one. Samuel pulled out the small pair of binoculars he sometimes carried for bird-watching and focused on the distant figure. Even at this distance, and through the magnification, he could see the woman's grief was profound and private. She was speaking to the headstone, her shoulders shaking with emotion that had been carried for decades. But whose grave was she visiting? Samuel knew the Byler family history well enough to know that Heinrich's parents and grandparents were buried in that plot, along with Heinrich himself and 2 infant children who had died in the 1970s. There was no reason Anna would be making secret pre-dawn visits to any of those graves with such obvious anguish, unless one of those graves didn't hold who everyone thought it did. That afternoon, Samuel made another difficult decision. He walked to the Byler farm, his father's walking stick steady in his hand, despite his inner turmoil, and knocked on Anna's door. She answered after a long moment, her face pale and drawn. At 63, she was still a handsome woman, but Samuel could see the weight of decades of guilt etched in the lines around her eyes. "Samuel Yoder," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "What brings you here?" "I was hoping we could talk, Anna, about the past." Something flickered across her face, fear perhaps, or resignation. She stepped aside to let him in, and Samuel found himself in a kitchen that felt heavy with memories and secrets. The house was spotlessly clean, but had the hollow feeling of a place where real life had stopped happening long ago. Anna poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly, and Samuel noticed she was still wearing her wedding ring, despite Heinrich's death 5 years earlier. They sat at her kitchen table in a silence that stretched uncomfortably until Samuel finally spoke. "I know about Thomas," he said quietly. Anna's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down. For a moment, Samuel thought she might deny everything, might maintain whatever story she had been telling herself for 30 years. But then her shoulders sagged, and when she looked at him, her eyes were filled with tears. "How?" she whispered. Samuel reached into his coat pocket and withdrew one of the letters, the one where Anna had revealed her pregnancy to Thomas. Anna's face went white as she recognized her own handwriting. "Where did you find this?" Her voice was barely audible. "In a cave up on the ridge, along with Thomas's body and the gun that killed him." Anna closed her eyes and began to weep, deep, silent sobs that seemed to come from the very center of her being. Samuel waited, his own heart breaking for the pain this woman had carried for so many years. "I never meant for any of it to happen," Anna said finally. "Thomas was so young, so full of life. Heinrich had grown cold toward me, and when Thomas showed me kindness, showed me love, I was too weak to resist." "What happened that night?" "The night Heinrich killed him." Anna's hands twisted in her lap. Heinrich had found the letters. He had been suspicious for weeks, watching me, following me. When he finally confronted me, I thought he might kill me too. Instead, he told me to write to Thomas, to arrange one final meeting. Samuel felt sick as the pieces fell into place. "You were bait." Heinrich said if I cooperated, if I helped him end it cleanly, he would forgive me. He said we could start over, rebuild our marriage. Anna laughed bitterly. I was desperate enough to believe him. "So you arranged the meeting at the quarry?" "Yes, but Thomas was suspicious. He brought a gun, said he didn't trust Heinrich to let us walk away. They fought and the gun went off." Anna's voice broke. "Thomas died in my arms, bleeding and begging me to take our baby and run." Samuel's throat tightened. "The baby?" "I lost the child 2 weeks later. The shock, the grief. My body just couldn't carry the burden anymore." Anna wiped her eyes with a handkerchief that looked like it had seen decades of tears. I buried my baby in our family plot, in the small grave everyone thinks belongs to a stillborn child from 1995. I visit them both, Thomas in the cave where Heinrich left him, and our child in the only grave I could give them. The revelation hit Samuel like a physical blow. Anna had been visiting 2 graves all these years, Thomas's hidden resting place and their child's unmarked burial site. The depth of her guilt and grief was staggering to contemplate. Why didn't you go to the authorities? Tell them what really happened. Anna's laugh was hollow. Who would have believed me? Heinrich was a deacon, a respected man. I was an adulteress who had gotten my lover killed. And besides, she paused, her expression growing fearful. Heinrich wasn't alone that night. Jacob Miller helped him move the body, helped create the story about Thomas drowning in the creek. Bishop Eli falsified the death records. The whole thing was covered up to protect the community's reputation. Samuel's suspicions were confirmed, but hearing it spoken aloud still shocked him. The conspiracy had involved the highest levels of their church leadership, men whose moral authority had shaped the community for decades. They told me that if I ever spoke about what really happened, they would make sure I was shunned, cast out with nothing. Anna continued. My own family would be forbidden to speak to me. I would lose everything, my home, my community, my identity. All I would have left would be the truth. And what good would truth do anyone if Thomas was already dead? Samuel stared at this broken woman who had lived with such terrible knowledge for 30 years, isolated by secrets that had poisoned every aspect of her life. He understood now why she had never remarried after Heinrich's death. Why she lived alone in this house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Anna, Samuel said gently, don't you think Thomas deserves to be properly buried? Don't you think his family deserves to know the truth? Anna looked at him with eyes that held 3 decades of fear. Samuel, these are dangerous men. Jacob is still alive, still influential in the community. Bishop Eli has protected this secret for 30 years. Do you think he'll hesitate to protect it now? If you pursue this, you won't just be risking your own safety. You'll be putting Clara in danger too. As Samuel walked home in the gathering dusk, Anna's warnings echoed in his mind. But so did the image of Thomas Stoltzfus, alone in that dark cave, denied even the basic dignity of proper burial. Justice delayed was justice denied, and 30 years had been. Far too long already. The wedding ring he had seen in the cave, evidence that could finally give Thomas his name back and his family the closure they deserved, felt like it was burning a hole in his memory. The question now was whether Samuel had the courage to act on what he knew, knowing that doing so might cost him everything he held dear. Samuel's sleepless nights finally drove him to seek spiritual guidance from the one person in their community whose moral authority had never been questioned, Bishop Eli Lapp. At 81, Bishop Eli was the eldest member of their church leadership and had served as their spiritual shepherd for over 40 years. If anyone could help Samuel navigate the moral complexities of what he had discovered, it would be the man who had baptized him, married him to Martha, and presided over every significant moment in Samuel's spiritual life. The bishop lived in a small house adjacent to the church, a humble dwelling that reflected his commitment to simplicity and service. Samuel arrived just after dawn, knowing that Bishop Eli maintained the old custom of beginning each day with private prayer and scripture reading. Bishop Eli answered the door with the serene expression that had comforted so many members of their community over the decades. His white beard was neatly trimmed, his plain clothes impeccably clean, and his eyes held the gentle wisdom of a man who had devoted his life to shepherding others through their darkest hours. Samuel, the bishop said warmly, what brings you here so early? Is everything well with your family? I need guidance, Bishop, about a matter that's been weighing heavily on my conscience. Bishop Eli invited him in and poured coffee from a pot that had been warming on the wood stove. They sat in the simple parlor where the bishop had counseled countless members of their community. surrounded by well-worn furniture and shelves lined with theological books that had been read and reread over the years. Samuel had rehearsed this conversation in his mind dozens of times, but sitting here in the presence of the man who had been his spiritual father for decades, he found himself struggling to find the right words. Finally, he decided on the direct approach. "Bishop, I've discovered something about Thomas Stoltzfus's death, something that suggests it wasn't an accident." Bishop Eli's expression didn't change immediately, but Samuel noticed the older man's hands had grown very still on his coffee cup. "Thomas Stoltzfus," the bishop repeated slowly. "That was a great tragedy." "What kind of discovery are you referring to, Samuel?" Samuel pulled out one of Anna's letters and placed it on the small table between them. "I found these in a cave up on the ridge, along with Thomas's actual remains. He was murdered, Bishop, shot and hidden away, while everyone was told he had drowned in the creek." Bishop Eli picked up the letter with hands that Samuel now noticed were trembling slightly. As he read Anna's desperate words about her pregnancy and her fear of Heinrich's growing suspicions, his face grew ashen. "Where exactly did you find this?" the bishop asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "In a hidden cave that Clara discovered during one of our walks. Thomas's body is still there, along with the gun that killed him, and a tin box full of letters like this one." Bishop Eli set the letter down and walked to the window, his back to Samuel as he stared out at the church where he had preached about truth and justice for 4 decades. When he finally turned around, Samuel was shocked to see tears streaming down the old man's cheeks. "Samuel," Bishop Eli said, his voice heavy with a burden Samuel was only beginning to comprehend. "There are things about that time, about Thomas's death, that you don't understand." "Then help me understand. Help me figure out what I should do with this information." Bishop Eli returned to his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 81 years. "What I'm about to tell you must never leave this room. Do you understand? Not unless you're prepared to destroy not just individual lives, but the foundation of our entire community." Samuel nodded. Though his heart was racing with anticipation and dread, Bishop Eli opened a drawer in the small table beside his chair and withdrew a leather-bound journal that looked like it had been well used over many years. "This is my personal record of significant events in our community," he said. "I've kept it for over 40 years, believing that someday someone might need to understand the difficult decisions we've had to make." He opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon and began to read, in a voice that grew steadier as he spoke. September 15th, 1995. Heinrich Beiler came to me tonight, distraught and seeking guidance. He had discovered his wife's adultery and had confronted the young man involved, Thomas Stoltzfus. In his rage and humiliation, Heinrich had shot Thomas during their confrontation. The young man was dead, and Heinrich was desperate for help in avoiding the scandal that would destroy not just his family, but potentially divide our entire community. Samuel felt the room spinning around him as the bishop continued reading. I prayed for wisdom and concluded that the greatest good would be served by avoiding public knowledge of these events. Anna Beiler was pregnant with Thomas's child, a fact that would bring additional shame upon the Beiler family. Jacob Miller agreed to help dispose of Thomas's body and create evidence suggesting he had drowned accidentally in Miller's Creek during the recent flooding. I falsified the death certificate to show accidental drowning, and we buried an empty coffin in the Stoltzfus plot. Bishop Eli looked up at Samuel with eyes that held 4 decades of guilt. I told myself we were protecting the community from a scandal that would tear families apart and bring shame upon our people. I convinced myself that since Thomas was already dead, nothing we could do would bring him back, but careful handling could prevent his death from destroying countless other lives. Samuel's mind reeled as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "You've known all along. For 30 years, you've known that Thomas was murdered and his body hidden away, and you've said nothing." "I've said nothing, but I've carried the weight of it every day since," Bishop Eli replied. Do you think it's been easy, presiding over communion services attended by Heinrich Beiler, knowing what he had done? Do you think I've slept peacefully, knowing that Thomas's family has been mourning at an empty grave while his real body lay, hidden in a cave? The bishop stood and walked to a bookshelf where he retrieved a small wooden box. Inside, Samuel could see several items that made his blood run cold. A bullet casing, a piece of fabric that looked like it had come from Thomas's shirt, and a photograph of the hidden cave entrance taken from inside, showing exactly where Thomas's body had been placed. "I kept evidence," Bishop Eli said quietly. "I told myself it was in case we ever needed to prove what had really happened. But I think the truth is that I couldn't bear to let Thomas disappear completely without a trace. These items were my way of ensuring that someone someday would be able to tell his real story." Samuel stared at the evidence that proved the bishop had not only known about the murder, but had actively participated in covering it up. How could you do this? How could a man of God participate in such deception? Bishop Eli's shoulders sagged. "Because I was weak, Samuel. Because when I was faced with the choice between justice for one dead man and peace for an entire community, I chose what seemed like the lesser evil. I told myself that God would understand, that preserving the stability of our church was more important than exposing a crime that couldn't be undone." The bishop returned to his chair, suddenly looking frail and ancient. "But I was wrong. Every sermon I've preached about truth and righteousness has been a mockery. Every time I've counseled someone about the importance of honesty and integrity, I've been a hypocrite. Thomas Stoltzfus deserved justice, and his family deserved the truth, and I failed them both." Samuel felt like everything he had believed about his community, about the moral foundations that had shaped his entire life, was crumbling around him. What am I supposed to do with this knowledge? How am I supposed to live with knowing that the leaders I've trusted and respected have been living a lie for 30 years? Bishop Eli looked at him with eyes that held deep sorrow, and surprisingly, what looked like relief. "You're supposed to do what I should have done 30 years ago, Samuel. You're supposed to tell the truth, regardless of the consequences. Thomas Stoltzfus deserves to be properly buried, and his family deserves to know how he really died." The old bishop reached across the table and placed his weathered hand on Samuel's arm. "I'm 81 years old, Samuel. I don't have many years left, and I can't carry this burden to my grave. If you're willing to be the instrument of truth that I was too cowardly to be, then I'll stand with you. I'll confess my role in the cover-up and face whatever consequences come." As Samuel walked home through the early morning mist, his mind struggled to process what he had learned. The plot was far deeper than he had imagined, involving not just Heinrich's moment of murderous rage, but a calculated conspiracy that had reached to the very top of their church hierarchy. Bishop Eli's personal diary and physical evidence proved that the cover-up had been carefully planned and meticulously executed. But the bishop's willingness to finally confess also represented something Samuel hadn't expected: hope. If Bishop Eli was prepared to tell the truth after 30 years of silence, then maybe justice for Thomas Stoltzfus was finally within reach. The question now was whether Samuel had the courage to see it through, knowing that exposing the truth would destroy not just individual reputations, but the entire structure of moral authority that had governed their community for decades. Samuel spent the next 3 days in spiritual agony, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. The worn leather Bible that had belonged to his father lay open on his kitchen table, its margins filled with handwritten notes that represented 4 generations of Yoder family wisdom. Samuel found himself returning again and again to the passages his father had marked about moral courage and standing for truth, even when that truth came at great personal cost. "The righteous man walks in his integrity," his father had written beside Proverbs 27. "His children are blessed after him." Below that, in his father's careful script, sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the most necessary. On Thursday evening, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. He walked to the small house where David Stoltzfus lived with his wife and teenage children. David answered the door with flour on his hands and surprise on his face. It was unusual for community members to make unannounced visits during the dinner hour. "Samuel," David said, "is everything all right?" "David, I need to speak with you about your brother Thomas. It's important." Something in Samuel's tone must have conveyed the gravity of the situation, because David immediately stepped outside and closed the door behind him. "What about Thomas?" Samuel took a deep breath. "He didn't drown in Miller's Creek, David. He was murdered, and his body has been hidden in a cave on the ridge for 30 years. David's face went white. That's impossible. We buried him. I was at the funeral." "You buried an empty coffin," Samuel said gently. "Thomas was shot by Heinrich Beiler during a confrontation about an affair Thomas was having with Heinrich's wife. Jacob Miller and Bishop Eli helped cover it up to protect the community from scandal." David staggered backward, leaning against the wall of his house for support. "You're certain of this?" Samuel reached into his coat and withdrew the tin box, opening it to show David the letters. "I found these with Thomas's remains. Anna Beiler has confirmed everything. Bishop Eli has kept evidence and is prepared to confess his role in the cover-up." David's hands shook as he picked up one of the letters, reading his brother's name in Anna's desperate handwriting. 30 years, he whispered. 30 years we've been grieving over a lie." "I wanted you to hear it from me before anyone else," Samuel said, "and I wanted to ask what you think we should do." David looked up with eyes that burned with 3 decades of misdirected grief. "We're going to get my brother the burial he deserves, and we're going to make sure everyone knows the truth about what happened to him." That same evening, Samuel made another difficult visit, this one to his own son David and daughter-in-law Rebecca. He found them in their kitchen, Clara playing quietly with her doll while her parents cleaned up after supper. The domestic tranquility of the scene made what Samuel had to do even more painful. "I need to talk to you both about something," Samuel said, his voice heavy with the weight of what was coming. "It concerns Clara's safety and our family's future." Rebecca immediately picked up Clara, her maternal instincts responding to the seriousness in Samuel's tone. David set down the dish he had been drying and gave his father his full attention. Samuel told them everything, about Clara's discovery of the cave, about the letters and Thomas's remains, about the conspiracy that had involved some of the most respected men in their community. As he spoke, he watched his son's face cycle, through disbelief, anger, and finally a grim understanding of the implications. "So what you're telling me," David said slowly, "is that Jacob Miller, the man who helped us when Mama died, who's been like an uncle to our family, is capable of murder and has been threatening you and Clara." "Jacob didn't kill Thomas," Samuel clarified, "but he helped cover it up, and he's made it clear that he'll protect that secret by any means necessary." Rebecca's arms tightened around Clara. "What does this mean for us? For our family?" Samuel looked at his granddaughter, who was listening to the adult conversation with the serious expression she wore when trying to understand things beyond her years. "It means that tomorrow, at the harvest celebration, I'm going to tell everyone what really happened to Thomas Stoltzfus. Bishop Eli will be there to confirm the truth and confess his role in covering it up. David Stoltzfus will be there to demand justice for his brother." David's eyes widened. "Pop, that's going to destroy people. Jacob, Bishop Eli, the whole community structure. Some things need to be destroyed if they're built on lies and murder," Samuel said firmly. "Thomas Stoltzfus deserves justice, and his family deserves the truth. More importantly, Clara deserves to grow up in a community that values truth over comfort, justice over convenience." Rebecca looked frightened. "What if they try to stop you? What if Jacob or others decide that silencing you is worth the risk?" Samuel pulled out a manila envelope he had been carrying. "I've written down everything. Every detail of what I discovered, every conversation I've had, every piece of evidence I found. I've made copies and hidden them in 3 different places. If anything happens to me, the truth will still come out." That night, Samuel sat at his kitchen table with his father's Bible open before him, preparing for what might be the last quiet evening of his life. He had written detailed letters to each of his children, explaining his decision and asking them to remember that sometimes love requires difficult choices. He had also written a letter to Clara, to be given to her when she was old enough to understand why her grandfather had chosen truth over safety. As he worked by lamplight, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. 2 weeks ago, he had been a simple grandfather, enjoying peaceful morning walks with his beloved granddaughter. Now he was preparing to tear apart the foundations of the only community he had ever known, driven by the conviction that some truths were too important to remain buried. The harvest. Celebration was scheduled for the next afternoon, a community-wide gathering that would bring together every family in their church district. It was a tradition that went back over a century, a time when their people came together to celebrate God's provision and strengthen the bonds that held their community together. Samuel had chosen this event deliberately. If he was going to reveal the truth about Thomas Stoltzfus, he wanted to do it in front of everyone at once, in a setting where no one could claim later that they hadn't been given a chance to hear all the facts. It would be devastating and traumatic, but it would also be complete and final. As the clock on his mantel chimed midnight, Samuel closed his father's Bible and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of another, if he survived the confrontation that was coming. Jacob Miller had spent 30 years protecting this secret, and men who were capable of covering up murder were capable of far worse if they felt cornered. Samuel's last conscious thought before sleep claimed him was a prayer, not for his own safety, but for the wisdom to speak the truth in a way that would honor Thomas's memory and begin the long process of healing their fractured community. He clutched his father's Bible to his chest like a shield, drawing strength from the generations of faithful men and women whose courage had made his own possible. In a few hours, everything would change. But for now, in the quiet darkness of his bedroom, Samuel Yoder rested in the peace that comes from knowing you have chosen the right path, regardless of where it leads. The truth revelation letter he had written lay sealed on his dresser, ready to be read aloud to a community that had no idea their carefully ordered world was about to be turned upside down. Inside that envelope was more than just an account of Thomas Stoltzfus's murder. It was a reckoning, 30 years in the making, and a chance for justice that had been delayed far too long. Tomorrow, the sleeping man in the cave would finally have his story told, and his killer would face the judgment that had been postponed for 3 decades. Samuel only prayed he would live to see Thomas properly buried and his family finally given the closure they deserved. The harvest celebration began like every other year, with families arriving at the church grounds in buggies loaded with food and children. The October air was crisp and clear, painted with the brilliant colors of autumn that made their valley look like something from a postcard. Samuel watched from his kitchen window as his neighbors gathered, their laughter and conversation carrying on the morning breeze, and felt his heart break for what he was about to destroy. Rebecca had prepared their traditional contribution, 3 apple pies that would have made Martha proud, but Samuel could see the tension in her movements as she wrapped them for transport. David moved around the kitchen with the careful efficiency of a man preparing for battle. His jaw set in the same determined line Samuel remembered from his own father's face during difficult times. Clara, oblivious to the undercurrents of adult anxiety, chattered excitedly about seeing her friends and playing the games that were traditional at the harvest celebration. She had insisted on bringing baby Sarah her cloth doll, and Samuel watched with a mixture of love and sadness as she made sure the doll was properly dressed for the special occasion. "Gross daddy," Clara said, tugging on Samuel's coat sleeve. "Are you feeling sad today?" Samuel knelt down so he was at eye level with his granddaughter, struck once again by her uncanny ability to perceive things that adults tried to hide. "I'm feeling many things today, little one. But mostly I'm feeling like it's important to tell the truth, even when it's hard." Clara nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her 3-year-old understanding of the world. "Like when I told Mama I broke her favorite cup, even though I was scared she'd be angry?" "Exactly like that," Samuel said, his throat tight with emotion. "Sometimes being brave means telling the truth, even when we're frightened of what might happen." The family walked to the church grounds together, Samuel's truth revelation letter tucked inside his coat pocket like a loaded weapon. He had sealed it in an envelope addressed to the entire community, and inside were 5 handwritten pages that contained every detail of his investigation into Thomas Stoltzfus's murder. The church grounds were already bustling with activity when they arrived. Long tables had been set up under the oak trees, groaning under the weight of traditional dishes that represented generations of family recipes. Children ran between the adults, their shouts and laughter creating the soundtrack of community celebration. Samuel saw Jacob Miller standing with a group of other elders, his weathered hands gesturing as he told some story that had his listeners chuckling. Bishop Eli was there too, moving through the crowd with his usual serene dignity, blessing food and greeting families with the gentle authority that had made him such a beloved spiritual leader. Looking at him now, knowing what Samuel knew about his role in covering up Thomas's murder, Samuel felt a complex mixture of pity and anger. David Stoltzfus had positioned himself near the central gathering area, his face grim with 3 decades of misdirected grief. Samuel caught his eye and nodded, the signal they had agreed upon. It was time. Samuel made his way to the small platform that was traditionally used for community announcements and harvest blessings. As he climbed the 3 wooden steps, his father's walking stick steady in his hand, conversations gradually quieted as people noticed his movement. There was something about his demeanor, the formal way he carried himself, the serious expression on his weathered face that commanded attention. "Friends and neighbors," Samuel began, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "Before we begin our celebration of God's provision, I have something important to share with all of you." A complete silence settled over the gathering. Children stopped their games. Adults turned to face the platform, and even the autumn breeze seemed to still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Samuel reached into his coat and withdrew the sealed envelope. The paper crackled as he opened it, the sound unnaturally loud in the expectant quiet. He looked out over the faces of people he had known his entire life, neighbors who had helped him through his wife's death, families whose children had played with his grandchildren, men and women whose approval and respect had shaped his understanding of himself for 7 decades. 30 years ago, Samuel said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. A young man named Thomas Stoltzfus was murdered in our community. His death was covered up by people we trusted, and his family has been grieving over a lie ever since. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Samuel saw Jacob Miller's face go pale, saw Bishop Eli close his eyes, as if preparing for a blow he had been expecting for 30 years. Anna Byler, standing near the back of the gathering, began to weep silently. "I know this because I have found Thomas's body," Samuel continued, his words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I have found the weapon that killed him, and I have found the letters that prove he was murdered by Heinrich Byler in a jealous rage over an affair with Heinrich's wife." The silence shattered like broken glass. Voices rose in shock and disbelief, some calling Samuel's claims impossible, others demanding more information. But Samuel wasn't finished. He had 30 years of injustice to address, and he would not be interrupted now. Jacob Miller helped dispose of the body. Samuel announced, his eyes finding Jacob in the crowd. Bishop Eli falsified the death records. Thomas Stoltzfus was murdered, and the truth was buried along with him, until now. The eruption of voices that followed Samuel's revelation was unlike anything their peaceful community had ever experienced. Some people shouted in disbelief, others demanded proof, and a few began moving toward the platform as if they intended to physically stop Samuel from continuing. But it was Jacob Miller's reaction that sent a chill through Samuel's bones. The elderly man pushed through the crowd with surprising agility, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "Oh, you foolish old man," Jacob shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Samuel stood his ground on the platform, his father's walking stick planted firmly beside him like a symbol of his resolve. "I've told the truth, Jacob, something that should have been done 30 years ago." "The truth?" Jacob's laugh was bitter and dangerous. "The truth would have destroyed this community. Do you think Thomas Stoltzfus was the only secret we've had to bury? Do you think his death was the only difficult decision we've had to make to keep our people together?" Bishop Eli had been making his way through the crowd, and now he climbed onto the platform beside Samuel. His face was ashen, but his voice was steady as he spoke to the gathering. "Samuel speaks the truth. I have carried the burden of this deception for 30 years, and I can carry it no longer." The crowd fell silent again, stunned by their spiritual leader's confirmation of Samuel's accusations. Bishop Eli reached into his coat and withdrew the small wooden box Samuel had seen in his study, the one containing physical evidence of the cover-up. "I kept these items," Bishop Eli said, opening the box for all to see. The bullet casing, a piece of Thomas's shirt, photographs of where his body was hidden. "I told myself it was to preserve evidence, but the truth is, I couldn't bear to let him disappear completely without a trace." Jacob Miller's face had gone from rage to something approaching panic. "Eli, you fool. Do you understand what this will do to all of us? To our families?" "It will set us free," Bishop Eli replied quietly. "Free from the weight of lies and deception that has poisoned our community for 3 decades. But Jacob wasn't finished fighting. Samuel watched in horror as the older man's hand went to his coat pocket and emerged holding something that made several people in the crowd gasp. A small pistol that looked like it had been well-maintained despite its age. "I won't let you destroy everything we've built," Jacob said, his voice now carrying a deadly calm that was more frightening than his earlier rage. "Thomas was a troublemaker who threatened our way of life. Heinrich did what needed to be done, and we protected our people from scandal and division." Samuel felt his heart racing, but he forced himself to speak calmly. "Jacob, put the gun down. This isn't 1995. You can't solve this problem with violence, can't I?" Jacob's eyes were wild now, darting between Samuel and Bishop Eli. 2 more unfortunate accidents, and this problem disappears forever. Who's going to question the deaths of 2 elderly men who had weak hearts? But Jacob had made a crucial mistake. In his desperation to silence Samuel and Bishop Eli, he had revealed his true nature to the entire community. The mask of gentle, caring elder had slipped away, revealing the calculating manipulator who had helped cover up murder 30 years ago. David Yoder stepped forward from the crowd, his face grim with determination. "You're not threatening my father, Jacob. Not in front of my daughter. Not in front of anyone." Other men in the community began moving closer to the platform. David Stoltzfus, several of the younger farmers, even some of the teenagers who were old enough to understand what was happening. Jacob found himself surrounded by people who were no longer willing to let him control the situation through intimidation. "This is what you've brought us to," Jacob said to Samuel, his voice breaking with what might have been genuine grief. "This is what your precious truth has accomplished. Division, conflict, the destruction of everything our fathers worked to build." Samuel looked out over the faces of his community, faces that showed shock, anger, confusion, but also something else, Relief. The relief that comes when a burden you didn't even know you were carrying is finally lifted from your shoulders. Our fathers built something beautiful. Jacob, Samuel said. But they built it on a foundation of lies, and lies always crumble eventually. Thomas Stoltzfus deserved better than to rot in a cave while his killer lived in honor. His family deserved better than to grieve over an empty grave. We all deserved better than to build our lives on deception. The sound of approaching sirens broke through the tension. Samuel saw David Stoltzfus standing near the edge of the crowd with a cell phone in his hand. He had called the authorities while Jacob was threatening Samuel and Bishop Eli. Jacob heard the sirens too, and for a moment Samuel thought the older man might choose to end things violently rather than face the consequences of his actions. But then Annabila's voice cut through the morning air, strong and clear, despite 3 decades of enforced silence. "Put the gun down, Jacob," Anna said, stepping forward from the crowd. "It's over. The truth is out, and no amount of violence will put it back in the box. Thomas can finally rest in peace, and so can we." Jacob looked at Anna with eyes that held 30 years of shared secrets, and something in his expression finally broke. The gun fell from his trembling hands, and he collapsed onto his knees as the weight of 3 decades of deception finally crushed what remained of his strength. 3 months later, Samuel stood in the same cemetery where he had once searched for clues about Thomas Stoltzfus. But now the scene was transformed by truth and healing. A new headstone had been erected, simple limestone, like all the others in their tradition, but bearing an inscription that finally told the real story. Thomas Stoltzfus, 1970-1995, beloved son and brother. His truth lives on. The memorial service had been unlike any funeral their community had ever held. Instead of the usual quiet grief over natural death, this had been a celebration of justice finally achieved and secrets finally brought into the light. David Stoltzfus had spoken about his brother with tears of both sorrow and relief, while Elizabeth, now 93 but still sharp-minded, had shared memories of the young man who had been taken from them too soon. Samuel felt Clara's small hand slip into his as they stood before the new memorial. At 3, she didn't fully understand the complex events that had reshaped their community, but she seemed to grasp that something important had been made right. The sleeping man isn't sleeping anymore. Is he, Grostadi? Clara asked with the simple wisdom that continued to amaze him. "No, little one," Samuel replied, his voice thick with emotion. "He's finally at peace." The months following the harvest celebration revelation had been difficult ones for their community. Jacob Miller had been arrested and charged with accessory to murder and evidence tampering. Despite his age, the district attorney had determined that the severity of the crimes and the decades of deception warranted prosecution. Jacob had ultimately pled guilty to lesser charges in exchange for his testimony about the events of 1995. Bishop Eli had stepped down from his position immediately, though he had been treated with more compassion by both the law and the community. His voluntary cooperation with authorities and his obvious remorse had earned him a suspended sentence and community service. More importantly, his honest confession had helped heal some of the wounds his long silence had created. Annabella had perhaps suffered the most dramatic change. After 30 years of carrying guilt and shame in isolation, she had found herself embraced by a community that finally understood the impossible position she had been forced to endure. Several women had organized regular visits to provide friendship and support, and Anna had begun attending church services again for the first time since Heinrich's death. "I never imagined I could feel peace again," Anna had told Samuel during one of their conversations. "For 30 years, I've lived with the fear that someone would discover the truth and destroy what little life I had left. Now that everyone knows, I find myself free in ways I had forgotten were possible." The community itself had struggled with the revelations, but Samuel had been surprised by how many people expressed relief that the truth had finally come out. There had been whispers and suspicions for decades, nothing specific enough to act on, but enough to create an undercurrent of unease that no one had been able to identify. "It's like we've all been holding our breath for 30 years, Rebecca had observed. "And we can finally exhale." New leadership had emerged in the wake of Bishop Eli's resignation. Younger voices, less burdened by the compromises of the past, had begun shaping discussions about how their community should move forward. There was talk of establishing formal policies for handling crises, of ensuring that transparency and accountability would prevent future cover-ups. Samuel had found his own role in the community transformed as well. Instead of being ostracized for destroying their peaceful illusion, he had been recognized as someone who had the courage to do what was necessary, even when it was painful. Parents pointed to him as an example of moral leadership, and several young men had sought his counsel on matters of conscience and integrity. But perhaps the most meaningful change had been in Samuel's relationship with Clara. Their morning walks had resumed, though they now took a slightly different path, one that passed by Thomas's proper grave and the small memorial garden that had been planted in his honor. "Tell me the story again." "Grossdaddy," Clara would often request as they walked. Not the story of the murder and cover-up, which was too complex and dark for a child her age, but the simpler story of how telling the truth, even when it was hard, had helped their community become stronger and more honest. Samuel would tell her about courage and integrity, about the importance of speaking up for people who couldn't speak for themselves, about how sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to let lies continue hurting people. These were lessons he hoped would shape her character as she grew, preparing her to face her own difficult decisions with wisdom and strength. The hidden cave where Thomas's body had been found had been sealed permanently, but not before a proper ceremony had been held there. Bishop Eli, in one of his final acts as spiritual leader, had blessed the site and offered prayers for Thomas's spirit and forgiveness for those who had wronged him. The cave entrance was now marked by a small plaque that read simply, "Truth revealed here." As Samuel and Clara walked home from the cemetery on this crisp January morning, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. 2 months ago, he had been a simple grandfather enjoying peaceful morning walks. Now he was a man who had helped reshape his community's understanding of justice and truth. The cost had been significant, relationships strained, institutions challenged, comfortable certainties destroyed. But the benefits had been even greater. Thomas Stoltzfus finally had the dignity of proper burial and the justice of truth told. His family had closure and peace. Their community had been cleansed of a poison that had been slowly corrupting it for 30 years. Most importantly, Clara would grow up in a place where truth was valued over convenience, where justice was more important than keeping uncomfortable secrets, where moral courage was recognized and respected. "Grossdaddy," Clara said, as they approached their farmhouse. "I love our walks together." Samuel squeezed her small hand gently. "So do I, little one." "So do I." Above them, the new community memorial caught the morning sunlight, a simple stone marker that would remind future generations that some truths are too important to stay buried, and that sometimes it takes the innocence of a child to help adults find the courage to do what's right. The sleeping man was finally at peace, and so was the community that had learned to choose difficult truth over comfortable lies.